called Proportion Geometry. Today we're going to be talking about what's called rationally composed buildings. You know, what does that really mean? Of course, every architectural composition, of course, by much or all of the famous architects we've seen in the past couple of months are rationally composed, but specifically, we're going to be talking about rationalism as applied to a movement in architecture that's called roughly during the Age of Enlightenment, specifically Neoclassicism, partially in France and partially in Germany, Neoclassicism 1700s, composed of pure geometry. We just talked about Baroque architecture earlier, how the geometry was morphed. But for the most part, the rationalism in rationally composing buildings is using pure geometry as a rebellion against Baroque and Rococo styles. So this is roughly after, Baroque and Rococo styles, roughly the start of the 1700s, several different architects we're going to look at. So Neoclassicism we're going to be looking at primarily in France, pure geometric form. I mentioned rebellion against Baroque and Rococo styles. If you remember, those are very overdone and very exuberant in terms of its geometry and, of course, its architectural language. So we're going to be looking at orthogonal versus elliptical and compounded curves in terms of form. Really, these three wonderful architects, these are not in chronological order. They're really ordered in based on its geometry. Carl Schenkel, a German architect, Claude Ledoux, and then I'm just going to pronounce his name as Boulay. It's really Etienne Louis Boulay. So roughly starting at 1728 until about 1840. So really these three really wonderful buildings, Carl Schenkel's, this is the Altes Museum in Germany. This is called the Farmer's Pavilion, which is actually occupied around some of the original walls in the city of Paris, Claude Nicolas Ledoux. And of course, Boulay. Now, Boulay's work is very visionary, and not a lot of his projects were built. Difficult to construct, just a monumental scale of proportion, size, and of course, his infinite wisdom and ambition to create and imagine buildings and places like this. Before we shift to the next slide, you can see the scale of this enormous sphere. The people are these tiny little dots at the very bottom of that plinth. So pretty much we're going to be looking at architecture and going back to its basic pure form, the sphere, the circle, the rectangle. So pretty much we're going to be looking at architecture composed of the cube, the pyramid, and the sphere. With a few exceptions. When we get into French architecture, remember this, the French Mansard roof is a hybrid of two angles. It's a double pitch. The steep part that adjoins with the facade, and then of course the shallower part which meets the ridge. Now in Bernard Haussmann's plan of Paris, roughly during this time, is that the French Mansard roof above the facade was really technically not taxable. So if you look at the city of Paris, you see mostly French Mansard roofs. The section, the square footage, the windows underneath the roof were technically not taxable. But it's interesting that the language and that proportion comes into play with mostly French architecture. You would never see this in Rome or Italian architecture. This is really specifically French architecture. And of course, we see derivations and uses of the Palladian Arch. We've seen our last lecture that architects are the best thieves in the world. They kind of borrow different things and motifs and improve on it and kind of readjust the scale and proportion for their particular design pedagogy. So we're going to talk about really the rediscovery of Pompeii in 79. Of course, it was created in the first century AD, but rediscovered in the 1700s during the Neoclassical period. This is a very major influential historical shift in architecture, interior design, furniture design, proportion, and geometry. Of course, we're reintroducing linear perspective. Now, remember, in the Renaissance, roughly 1400s, Brunelleschi, the Florentine architect, discovered perspective when he was working on the Cathedral of Florence. Of course, this was before we discovered that, I'll show you, I think I have a slide of this later, but we'll see that linear perspective was already discovered in the first century AD, but of course it was covered up by the volcano for several thousands of years. So when they discovered it in the 1700s, they were able to see that, wow, they've already discovered linear perspective. What I'm saying is this is very influential design ideology in, of course, really neoclassical architecture. So what we're going to be looking at is a transition from Baroque, Rococo, I have some slides of each one of these, to neoclassical architectural styles, really seen through the eyes of several kings, Louis XIV, the 15th, and the 16th. You don't have to really, if you want to write down the dates in your notes, that would be great. I just want you to remember, let's start at the three different kings based on their geometry. Really, 14 and 15 were a morphed geometry. They're very geometrically complicated. There's compounded curves, convex curves, similar to what we saw in Hadrian's Villa, where Apollodorus was combining all the convex and concave curves to make a very kind of warped geometry. That's kind of a precursor to Baroque geometry. So really, these three kings were very influential about the way that some of the forms in geometry shaped its architecture. But for our purposes in the lecture today, rationalists, we're going to be looking at pure geometric forms, spheres, squares, cylinders, unadulterated forms. It's interesting that we kind of go back to our original roots of composition and geometry in ancient Greco and Roman styles. So we've seen Baroque. I just want to quickly show this to you because it's interesting the way architecture kind of changes its paradigm every several centuries. We've seen the very ornate, complex geometry using ellipses and triangles and curves in both these really wonderful Baroque churches, San Carlo and St. Ivo, both in Rome, designed by Borromini. Of course, you know, to imagine, draw, and construct these things, the experience, what I was saying is, it's like you're walking into a large, enormous cloud, just based on the sort of mixture of the geometrical relationships we're looking at. Of course, again, we've seen the very complicated mystical geometric relationships, the triad, and of course the circles. Incredible work, mostly done in plaster and wood painted. So let's take a look at Louis XIV and the 15th. We can see that really the interiors are very overdone, and there's really no geometrical language in this. This is really heavily adorned by multiple, difficult to construct, difficult to draw. It's really hard to tell where the ceiling meets the wall. That's the whole point, is that they're kind of trying to blend all planes together in this kind of undulating surface. You know, you can see everything is, you know, polychrome, gilded, and a display of this sort of disgusting level of wealth that we had in King Henry XIV and the 15th. Of course, there's not a very clear ordering of geometry at all, except for the door openings and the fireplace. But for the most part, everything has this sort of really undulating Baroque / transition to Rococo architecture. Even in the furniture, you know, imagine taking a working drawing that has multiple ellipses and all these curves to really create these things. Of course, we're really getting away from the basic pure geometrical styles in this period. So then we get to Louis XVI, very rectilinear. There's a reason for that. We can see that now we're articulating the ceiling versus the wall with a simple cornice. We see the rectilinear geometry. We see rectangles, possibly golden section rectangles. But look at the small rectilinear scale of the furniture with the interior facades themselves. So we're not doing overdone, crazy paneling with multiple curves. It's a very simple, it's a more simple geometry than kind of what we've seen before. Again, the furniture is a little more rectilinear. We can see an architectonic language with the inverted terms, with the legs. But probably mostly due to this rediscovery of Pompeii frescoes. Really started excavating in 1738. What's remarkable is they removed the volcanic ash from Mount Vesuvius that erupted. We can see the linear perspective language on the frescoes has already been established 1400 years before Brunelleschi rediscovered linear perspective in the Renaissance. And of course, the colors are extremely, this has been restored, of course, but by removing the volcanic ash, we're seeing, you know, the ancient Greek and Roman language of architecture in play here after they removed all the volcanic ash. This is a very pivotal aesthetic and architecturally designed ideology, especially in architecture and interior design. Of course, we can see it evident in the interiors. Of course, we see rectilinear forms. We're getting away from the sort of Baroque style. Now, remember this particular image when we talk about Carl Friedrich Schenkel's work. The colors and, of course, the panels. But we're going to start talking about really rationalism in architecture, roughly due to Claude Nicolas Ledoux. I'm sure you guys have probably seen this incredible drawing. This is a drawing he created while working on many of his projects. This is kind of a symbol that he uses throughout his project. It's called the all-seeing eye. This is not the first time we've seen an eye, of course, drawn in architecture, but we're seeing the eyeball is actually superimposed in one of his large theaters or amphitheaters he designed. I'm not sure if the theater was actually built, but it's really an icon for the masonry image, an eye for the Freemasons, the stonemasons that were technically part of not a cult, but a fraternal organization. And this motif appears in a lot of his work, especially with his oculuses or oculi he does in his buildings. This is a very famous drawing that was done in the 1700s by the architect Ledoux. So one of his earlier projects was, of course, the salt work at Arc at Cezanne. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right. But the original plan was, of course, like a large eye. It's a complete circle. These are pavilions and workshops for, this is outside of the city of France, but of course, the architectural language is we're using the pure circle. We were only able to build half of it. So what you're seeing is a semicircular arch with the pavilions that I think manufacture and refine parts of some materials in the provincial part of France. But in terms of the architecture, we can see that also this is kind of a quote that Ledoux was discussing about his work, is that he remarked that the plan of the salt work should be as pure that described by the Sun King. This is roughly the Sun King Louis XIV. So construction began roughly in 1775 and began about 3 years later. Production rarely rose above half of the project volume and easily harvested tidal salt, deeply undercut processed rock salt in price. So in other words, he was only able to build half of that. So of course, there's the oculus from his famous eye that he's drawn before, but the architecture is a very unique interpretation of the Greek classical front. What he's doing is he's taking the rectangular block and carving the round Doric columns and capitals out of the mass of the rectilinear column. Very unusual and very original to do this. Is a very serious, massive way to treat architectural columns and facades. Of course, we've seen this as the Doric order because you're seeing the triglyphs and the metapiece expressed on the frieze. So this detail for the orders is really evident in strictly the Doric order, not Ionic and Corinthian. So there's another black and white photograph. We can see pretty much all the details are very heavily expressed. The mutals, the triglyphs, the metapiece, the brackets on the pediment, and of course, re-emphasized and exaggerated in the rectilinear blocks that create the Doric order. It looks like somebody took a large rectilinear block of salt and carved out the curves out of that block. Maybe that was his original intention for the language of architecture. It is a very powerful building, very beautifully done. Now, the Doric order is very carefully articulated and expressed in this facade. There's a detail. I think pretty much each one of these blocks is carved out of one piece and assembled together with iron rods and mortar. There's a wonderful view of the parts of the other buildings are framed by these massive Doric columns and the rectilinear blocks. There's another image of this. Very striking visual relationship. There's another one of the pavilions. This is what's considered technically a grotto, the large arch with kind of reflecting pool behind that. We can see the massive Doric columns are Greek Doric because there's no base. But there again, we can see the ratio of the classical orders coming into play in the Doric order. Of course, we can see that the horizontal striations are the individual blocks that make the columns. They're not carved out of one piece. It's interesting that in this phase in neoclassical rationalism, the horizontal bands are very heavily emphasized. It's really unusual because normally the Greek architectural language expresses the verticality, but I think he's literally making observations about the salt blocks that are being carved out of here. But it's a very original and unique way to approach the Doric order in this instance. Now, again, we can see the French Mansard roof is coming into the language in the roof. Of course, the double pitch, which is very original to French architecture, definitely not Italian, definitely not Greek or Roman. Okay, so here's another, this is a large pavilion. It's interesting that Ledoux mixes several different motifs. We see the Greek temple front, ironically done in square blocks, not round columns. Then of course, the only round part is a large cylindrical dome. This is actually incorporated into some of the walls around Paris, the original medieval walls. This is a large pavilion. These are actually some of the gates around the original Parisian walls. But what he's doing is he's using the Greek and Roman temple fronts and the pure geometry relationship. He's superimposing the Palladian Arch for the colonnade around the outside of the drum. It's really interesting that there's really no entablature in the round cylindrical drum. There's simply just the columns, and the arches bear the weight on top of the capitals. Then of course, what normally is the frieze, can you guys see my cursor in the PDF? Normally the frieze would have, of course, the Tricus of Metabes. The frieze is pushed above the square openings above the arches. And of course, the cornice is a very small relationship relative to the size of the entire building itself. It's a little bit proportionally strange to have the base, the square base, a large simplified cornice with no profile. And of course, the delicate profile is the small little elegant curve around the top of the dome. It's interesting that Ledoux is sort of simplifying the language of ancient Greece and Roman architecture into definitely a more powerful, simple language of architecture. It's interesting to see the round columns for the cylinder and the square ones, of course, for the large plinth. Both of these are the Doric order, Greek Doric, because of course the Greek Doric doesn't have the base on it. So again, we can clearly see that they're borrowing the early pure geometrical forms from ancient Greece and Rome. Here's another detail of one of the pavilions around the complex, is that it's interesting that things are over-designed and over-exaggerated. The keystone, which normally would be proportioned for the scale of the arch itself, is proportioned for the entire building. If you've read Complexity and Contradiction by Robert Venturi, a postmodern book, is that they talk about the language of exaggerating some of these details just for these kind of interesting optical effects. Again, it's interesting that the entablature between the arch and, of course, the columns are opened by, of course, the Cerulean or Palladian arch. Then, of course, the keystones are proportioned for the entire building, not just for the arch itself. Again, the rustication on this, the rustication are the large projected blocks. The horizontal is emphasized in this normally Greek and Roman proportioned pavilion. Of course, there's the oculus that Ledoux always incorporates as a metaphor for the eye that he's drawn earlier in the example we just saw. So a lot of these things are not occupiable buildings. They are architecture just to have, they're actually gates. Of course, you don't have to have air-conditioned square footage to have a piece of architecture. But of course, it's architecture. It's just an open-air gate. Here's another building. Of course, he's doing more careful details with the classical orders here. We see that the entablature is correctly proportioned. The cornice has, of course, the properly proportioned brackets underneath the cornice. This is another Ledoux part. I'm not sure which project this one is, but it's interesting how he incorporates the very heavy, thick wall as the Roman arches march along the colonnade here. It's interesting, you rarely see him using the Corinthian order. He's using the simplest order because he's simplifying a lot of these massive architectural compositions into its basic pure form. So we're really using Doric and probably the Tuscan order and the columnar order. This is another projected project. This is, I don't think this is actually built. House for a surveyor, probably a surveyor and a hydrologist. But it's interesting that we can see the solid and void condition. The solid is the large cylinder turned horizontal. And of course, the basin for the water is the opposite of the curve, cut out as an opposite relationship. But of course, on the facades, we can see the simple Cerulean or Palladian arch with very little decoration. It's pretty much the solid body of the facade of the curve. Of course, the Cerulean arch is cut out of a solid block. It looks like it's carved out of a solid masonry block, but of course, it's built up in individual blocks. But it's intriguing that pretty much all the facades, the surfaces are treated as undecorated facades. There's really no, we don't see an introdos and an exodos. We don't see a lot of carvings. It's really just simply the clear open. It's almost like somebody took a large block of stone and just cut it out with of course, a chisel. But that's the architectural language that Ledoux is trying to incorporate here. So it's a very undecorated style or motif in neoclassical architecture, predominantly in Ledoux's work. Of course, we've seen the Palladian Arch reinstated by Palladio. It's really a Cerulean arch that Palladio uses as a motif. Of course, the 1500s, this of course in the 1700s that that Ledoux has tried to bring back into the original style of his language of architecture. So again, we can see the pure geometric relationship, the curve, of course, with the solid block. We're going to change gears here. We're going to talk about Carl Schenkel again first in this section. We're going to go back to some of the architects we talked about earlier. We're going to look at the Alti Museum in 1823. This is really roughly the end of the 1800s is really the end of the neoclassical period. But I'm showing this because I want to make sure that we see the classical Greek and Roman temple coming into play. This is a large plan in the museum. We see the large loggia with the column, probably Greek, Ionic, or Doric columns. The front, let's look at the facade. Now we're actually looking at Roman Ionic, because Roman Ionic has the volutes and of course the profiled base of it. So it kind of looks like we're borrowing the Greek stoa from ancient Greece and incorporating, mixing the Pantheon as the model for this entire building. So the front we're seeing is the the Roman Ionic, and of course we're seeing the Greek stoa front superimposed in the Pantheon's dome behind the wall. It's intriguing that in this section you don't really see the dome from the exterior of the building. It's completely hidden, because I think Carl Friedrich Schenkel wanted the Greek temple front to be the primary reading, and of course you only experience the dome as an element of surprise upon entering the entry condition. So let's kind of look at the way that Carl Schenkel is articulating the front facade. Here's a section, here's the main Greek stoa section in the front. Here is of course the Pantheon dome he's modeling after in the center. Here's a wonderful engraving of the entry condition. I think now in modern times, they've enclosed this entire front with a butt joint glaze curtain wall of glass here. Originally was open. I think I've shown you some of Letrue's engravings before. He did, of course, edifices of modern Rome. He's done pretty much all the drawings and perspective vignettes as these engravings in the entire city of Rome. I think he did a lot of the engravings that I'm showing you in the lecture today. So of course, here's another wonderful photograph with, of course, lichen and probably patina on these stone columns. But let's remember the image that we saw of the ancient Pompeian villa that was covered up by ash. Particularly the way that the facades are done behind the colonnade. I'm sorry, this is actually Greek Ionic. We see the flutes, and of course the Greek columns are flat, and the spaces between the volutes are curved. There's a wave. Remember, Roman Ionic has a flat body between the two volutes, so this is technically Greek Doric. But of course, it has these really wonderful embedded marble panels. So let's take a look at this again. So here are some of the frescoes that were rediscovered in ancient Pompeii in the 1700s. So I think pretty much, I think all historians, architects are heavily influenced by rediscovering these frescoes that were covered up by volcanic ash for, almost 1,000 years. So I think the level of detail, the color, and the composition is literally evident in the facades. This is really unusual to do for the facade, because normally you would have, again, the reinstated of the details of the cornice, the columnar orders on the back facade. But again, we see a very simple square and rectilinear motif. It's just barely inlaid, and some of the lines and the marble detailing in some of these panels. Very original to do this, of course, but very ancient Greek to do this as well, especially when we're borrowing from the language of the ancient Pompeian architects that we see in the original frescoes. It's interesting how one little historical discovery can yield, an incredibly change in ideology and aesthetics and architecture, just by, looking at what was really discovered in the ancient Pompeian villas, and of course, covered by the volcanic ash. Let's take a look at, his name is Etienne Louis Boulay. I'm just going to refer to him as Boulay. He really does these large, enormous cenotaphs, of course, a memorial for these, probably for St. Isaac Newton, famous astronomers and other, but he's using primarily the sphere as the main proportioning system for the building, and of course, the main body of the space. These are very large, ambitious projects. He's more of a visionary than he was actually constructing things. I don't think a lot of these things were built. You've probably seen these in your history classes, but these are very bizarre and visually perplexing and very powerful compositions. Again, this is neoclassical. It's very simple. There's hardly any decoration or adoration on the facade. The thing is, this is the cenotaph for Newton. This entire building is a large sphere. The only really architectural move is the Palladian Arch, which of course announces the entry. It's interesting that the stairs separate the entire spherical body above the, I think originally the architect would have this entire sphere floating above the ground, but of course at this time we weren't able to structurally and physically do that. But of course the sphere is read as an object in, of course, this rectilinear space. Let's look at the cross section. This is an enormous building. Look how small the people are. The experience of this space is almost like the experience in walking into Baroque Cathedral. You're completely transformed into another world, into another realm. I was saying that the relationship with the experience in Baroque architecture is like you're walking into heaven. You see all these wonderful Baroque clouds. But in this instance, we're seeing, it's almost like we're walking outside at night. We see the entire constellation. We can see the moon. This is the cenotaph, a memorial for Sir Isaac Newton. A very powerful proposal. I mean, the only move is this enormous sphere you can experience as. I think what the architect was really intending is you would never see any corners at all. And I think ideally, Boulay would really want to actually walk into a completely unadulterated sphere. But of course, for functional reasons, we do have to have the stairs, the plinth for functional reasons for standing and experience this space. Very original for the 1700s. I don't think a lot of these were built. They were so imaginative, and I'm sure they had the capabilities of constructing something like this during the time. But it's interesting that the roof plinth is, of course, an outdoor garden. Of course, the sphere is partially subterranean and partially above ground. And one has to wonder if these are openings in the concrete or stone, or if these are actually painted in the spherical body. I'm assuming that they cut out holes to make the stars. When you experience this at night, then you would probably see the holes and, of course, the stone as these stars. But of course, you have to figure out it probably is a painted sky if this were actually built. So again, these are just really powerful pieces of architecture. It's a very different language of aesthetics. We're not using the classical orders to adorn the facade. It's more the experience of the interior of the space. So you would never see, Doric, Corinthian, or Ionic columns inside the shell of this, because it's really about the spatial power of just that one sphere. We try to attempt this in the Pantheon in Rome, but of course it's decorated with the columnar orders. We see the coffering on the ceiling. This is a large star and constellation at the center of this body. So this is what the space would look like during the day. This is what the space would look like at night. And I'm coming this as not a historian standpoint, but from a designer standpoint. So I don't know the etymology or the entire history of these places, but I'm just kind of showing you these as these radical sort of architectural moves that we don't really need the columnar orders to really break down the scale and to articulate the facades. Very futurist. It looks like an alien ship has landed in France in the 1700s. So you can imagine if this thing were built, a very bizarre sort of experience to visit these places. Now these really weren't built. This is a large proposal for a library and a basilica, but the scale that Boulay tries to create is just enormous. This supersedes any sort of scale in the ancient baths in Rome that we've seen, the Colosseum, any sort of building. Of course, it's interesting that he's using the Corinthian order because this is a giant building. This is an enormous barrel vault. It's interesting that the coffers are flat on the interior. So this is now a large round cylindrical dome at the top. Of course, what he's doing, he's transitioning from the dome to the square plan using these triangular pieces called the squinches in the dome. It's just interesting that the coffers are not only on the interior, but they're actually on the flat facades that transition from the skirt of the curve and the dome. But look at the way the colonnade, it's not just one column at the center. There's an entire loggia that is curved by the building on every surface. Pretty much every surface is a covered walkway that has a Corinthian capital. I'm sorry, this slide is relatively blurry, but it's interesting that he changed from a completely undecorated surface to something very decorated, really based on only Greek and Roman architecture, excuse me. So pretty much every surface has a coffer, every surface has a Corinthian order. Again, he's designing these enormous mausoleums based on ancient geometry, of course, in Egypt. Of course, he's mixing Egyptian motifs with the pyramid, and of course, superimposing the Roman arch as the entryway into these enormous structures. This is a cross-section of this pyramidal cenotaph. Here's the main space, a completely half semicircular space designed for the scale of the interior. Then, of course, the large body is designed for the scale of the exterior. So there's really two shells. So a lot of the domes in classical architecture have several different shells. We've seen that St. Paul's has at least 3 shelves, the scale of the dome for the city and the scale of the dome for the entire, just for the interior of the space itself. But of course, the scale is enormous. The only time we see decoration or coffering is really on the semicircular apses around the ground plane. Here's a wonderful plan of this. I'm not sure which cenotaph this one is, but we can see that the true geometric form is really expressed in the cylindrical body. Again, here's another mausoleum. It's interesting the way he mixes this enormous colonnade around the curve, and of course the dome is behind that. But of course these extra cryptoporticuses around the entire spherical body. Yeah, incredible work. This is, of course, a design for a large theater. I don't think any of his projects were built, but the structure just outside of the main space is just phenomenal the way he does these. I'm assuming that he's imagining these in stone because we're still not really building with concrete. We're not building with reinforced concrete later until the 1890s. So this is still technically neoclassical architecture in the 1700s. Of course, the facade is surprisingly decorated with, of course, the Corinthian order, the giant order. Here's another basilica plan. I think these are all imaginary spaces really not built. But normally what would have been a Palladian arch, it's interesting the way that Boulay returns the colonnade as this interior facade, just barely touching the curves. Normally you would probably doing a large facade here, but of course he leaves the entire end facade open with just a tiny little projection of the colonnade around that. But look how simply stated the entry door is on the base here, and of course the sunken body in this enormous basilica. You know, these are just fantastic compositions in geometry without using complex curves like we've seen in Baroque architecture, but they still yield some very powerful results. But it's really interesting that he combines just the basic pure geometric sphere. The only time it really breaks that simplicity is the Palladian Arch. Okay, we've seen these projects. So, you know, we really see neoclassical architecture as kind of a simplified, pure geometric form, really in these 3 architects. You know, it's really great to see an imagination coming into play here, especially with these projects. Okay, well, we went over a lot of information. That's technically the end of the lecture. I'm happy to go back and answer questions, or I can go back and stop on some of the slides. I'm happy to go back and revisit some of the stuff we talked about. It's almost 12:40. So I'm happy to go back and kind of revisit some of the stuff we talked about.
I also want to mention, if anybody didn't see the chat, Carolyn Lloyd posted an essay that you guys are welcome to read.
Okay. You know, it's really great to see the way that each architect interprets the original classical language. There's rules and canons of proportion, but it's interesting that some of these people deliberately kind of break the mold for these really intriguing visual effects, especially the square columns. Very original to do that.
That one.
Yes, this one.
What's that?
Yeah, I'm not sure which building that one is. That is definitely designed by Ledoux, but I think it's a pavilion, and it's interesting that the geometry is technically, it looks like an elliptical body for the entry space. Then of course the pavilion is, I'll have to get back to you. I'm not sure which building that one actually is. I'm not sure that one was built. I think it was a proposed project, but some of the projects I look at don't really have a name, especially if they're not built. Some of these are conjectural projects, unless somebody knows which project this one is.
It's interesting. It looks like it was just built or designed for a building just in the fabric of a city.
Yeah, it does look like, you know, I'm sure part of the context continues around that, but yeah, it does. It looks like they're using this existing context and superimposing the cylindrical space inside that. Mm-hmm. Valerie, do people have questions in the text box or?
Jay, would you mind going back to the Altus Museum plan?
Sure. Yes, this one.
Yeah.
It's interesting the way he articulates the cylindrical dome with the geometry around that. You know, normally it would just be the round cylindrical dome exposed to the interior quarters, but he's actually adding a loggia on the interior as a kind of a spatial transition from this courtyard to the main body of space.
So is that the main exhibition space?
This one is this. Yeah, I think it's a museum mostly for sculptures, not paintings. You look at the perspective. This is, yeah, I think. Well, the exhibit spaces are really here, but I think they're mostly sculptures and not paintings. You can see there's a few paintings, but the paintings are more the frescoes on the front, and of course there's sculpture inside of this. But
are the flanking courtyards not roof or?
I think those are. I think they used to be open to the sky. I think they might have enclosed them for when they enclosed. I think they enclosed them later. Yeah, I'm not sure if you can see this photograph, but they actually enclosed the entry with glass. So this is actually, you would actually enter this. This was actually covered with glass. So the entry space is now closed in. It used to be just completely open. Yeah, I think that it's a gallery for primarily sculptures. You know, I think it must have been very revolutionary in history to go back and discover Pompeii. And because for years, you know, people regarded Filippo Brunelleschi as the really inventor of perspective. But of course, he was a genius to create this without any sort of historical precedent. But then it's interesting to go back and see that they already figured that out and to, you know, incorporate that, the colors and the proportions, of course, in a normally would be a Greek building, of course, is now a neoclassical. I just think that that's a very elegant way to treat the wall surface. There's really no decoration. It's just either the paint or, of course, the inlaid marble stripes and the panels of that. Also, these are just some of the most futuristic buildings you're probably going to see in classical architecture. I mean, these are just really imaginative projects, but I don't think these are built. The scale is just absolutely overwhelming. I don't think they had the capabilities. I mean, I don't think they had the money or the time to actually construct these, but these are definitely the work of someone incredibly imaginative. It's still classical architecture, but you're not reinstating the classical orders. So.
Jay, while you're here, could you talk about the development of this roof?
This one?
Yes.
This is roughly the late 1700s. You mean the structure or?
They did not specify, so whatever you think is best.
Okay, well, let's take a look at this. I think this is a preliminary study for this project and for this one, but let's take a look at the cross-section of the tapering dome shell. The little holes you can see, I think those are cuts in probably, this would have been stone, not concrete, because concrete wasn't really used as a building material up until the 1890s with the steel concrete frame. Of course, we lost the formula for concrete during the Middle Ages, but the structure of this, I think it would have been, we're not showing, this is simply just a proposal, we're not showing the structure, but I think it would have been masonry, probably with stone. So if you look at the little cuts, those are probably holes to recreate a constellation at night. But I'm not really sure what this is probably layers of masonry and stone to be able to create this thing. It's really not clearly articulated in the cross-section. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not really sure of the structure because it looks like this is an open shell. Hold on just a minute. There's a police car going by, an ambulance. Sorry about that.
Jay, I think the question in the chat was asking about the development of the Mansard roof, how it came about.
Oh, the Mansard roof. I'm sorry. Let me go back. Yeah, well, it's really, hold on a minute. Yeah, this roof. Yeah, it's a very, is this the one you're talking about? The Mansard roof? It's a very classic form for French roofs in the countryside. Of course, the city of Paris, they really use this in the city of Paris as a way of Bernard Haussmann as unifying, I wish I don't have a picture of a city of Paris, but of unifying the aesthetics to where all the roofs really have this form as a way of kind of unifying the aesthetics of the main city of Paris. What I was saying is the roof has two pitches because, excuse me, the square footage under the roof is not taxable in the city of Paris. So you could build, if you look at some of the buildings in Paris along the Seine River, they have 3 pitches. They have several different heights. The dormers climb on all different parts. So I think that was really to get away from taxing all the square footage under the roof. But it's a very typical French theme. You would never see a double pitched roof in Tuscany or Italy or Rome. Of course, it's a very French kind of way to do their roofs. Did that answer your question? And this is really done with wood. So, yeah, did that answer your question? Okay, I hope it did. What I'm saying is interesting that architecture goes in phases constantly. Because right now in architecture school, and I'm teaching at modern architecture, the phase now is these kind of digitally generated morphs and blobs. When I look at the blobs and the undulating forms, I of course go back to Rococo and Baroque architecture. But of course, this geometry has a rule or canon of way of ordering the parts. When the digital software that determines the form of student work, there's no ordering or language. It's just blobs all you can eat. So even as complex and complicated as this, there is still a specific set of radii or curves that are established. I think the sort of language of architectural form in the digital realm now has somewhat gotten lost just by the base that someone is letting the digital software design the form for them. And they certainly didn't let them do that in these examples. We can see that there is an undulating form, but it's a repetitive element with the same geometrical relationship. But then again, it's the same thing, we saw art, we left Art Nouveau, went to Art Deco. Of course, Art Nouveau was crenellated and undulating and wavy. Then of course, the Art Deco phase after that was more rectilinear. It's the same relationship. We're going from Baroque, Rococo to neoclassical architecture was more linear, rectilinear. I just think it's interesting that, everything goes in particular phases. So. I thought this was just a really wonderful columnar order, the way he mixes the blocks with the curves. That's really brilliant. Of course, I think we've seen this in Mannerist architecture in the Renaissance Italian, but we're seeing this in a neoclassical idiom. Look how carefully sculpted and carved and articulated the triglyphs and metopes are in these facades. Because remember, in some of the first lectures in the classical orders, you would always, the metopes, the space between the triglyphs were always square. That was done in 700 BC. We're looking at 1700 AD. So, Claude Ledoux is, altering the language or the ratio there. But it still is beautiful. We're still using the ratio of the height of the columns to proportion the entablature and, of course, the pediment there. So again, this is definitely a French roof because we're seeing the double pitch on the central pavilion. Well, we have about 10 more minutes. I'm sure you guys have other questions. Are there other questions in the chat box? I'm not able to see the chat box on my end for some reason, but. I was going to show, let's look at the Greek Stoa for a minute. Of course, this is Greek architecture, roughly probably 600 or 700 BC. There's of course, we see the fluting normally goes from the base to the top of the capital. But in this instance, they left them smooth because they were concerned that people's fingers would break these off. I don't know if that's an urban legend or a true story, but it's interesting when you see a lot of Greek columns is that the base is left, where the intersex begins at a third of the column's height, is that they're smooth for functional reasons. I thought that was interesting. Now, not everything is decorative. It does have a functional purpose. But it's really interesting that, I hate it when people go back and just completely clean all the buildings. Like the aged patina, the lichen on this is really wonderful. It would take hundreds of years to get this, this richly patinaed column, but look how exquisite the texture is. I'm sure it was beautiful and clean like this originally, but with age, I think Ruskin said, the true value of a building comes 400 years later after it's aged. That was either Ruskin or Vitruvius, but we can see that quote coming into the detail and the texture of the way these columns have been patinaed. Essentially, the columns are patinaed, but the panels are bright, spanking new and bright candy apple red. So they're probably cleaned. Or marble doesn't, of course, marble ages very well with little patina, but the stone, of course, is more porous and absorbing the atmosphere and some of the pollution in the atmosphere. But a really wonderful language of the gray next to the bright red marble panels that are on the wall.
I have a quick question, or maybe not quick, we'll see. But
sure.
Just looking at these images, they're strikingly modern in the sense that, they're really looking to get down to, like you said, the simple geometric forms, strip down as much of the detailing as possible. Mm-hmm. And I'm just curious if the kind of like 20th century modernist architects pointed to these types of buildings as inspiration for the modern movement of the early 20th century.
Yeah, I'm sure they did. If you look at some elements of the World's Fair in the 1920s, they clearly used the pure geometric relation of the sphere, the pyramid, of course, the square. When I look at this, I see the World's Fair in 1920 or 1936, the pure sphere. This is really an unprecedented sort of paradigm to just use an undecorated sphere with just a few openings. And a little bit scary and intimidating to occupy this enormous scale of the building. But of course, the outside is really just, this is probably the first time we've seen just in architecture, just a completely unadorned body, except for the pyramids. Of course, the pyramids are triangles, but we're seeing a sphere very, very, very carefully punctuated with just a few openings. But that is an interesting question. It's a little problematic because the stairs are either so ridiculously steep or very shallow. I think the draftsman on this was a little bit questionable, the angle of the stairs, but you're right. Yeah, I see very little columnar order or language on the exterior, except of course, his later work was like on this one. Yeah, so I think this is really a precursor to truly modern architecture when we're using steel and concrete.
It makes me wonder what the people at the time thought of some of these buildings. I bet it was quite the shock in some ways.
I like to think this architect as the early Frank Lloyd Wright, because when you see some of early Frank Lloyd Wright's buildings, especially the Unitarian Church, you remember those beautiful little square blocks in concrete. He must have been one hell of a salesman to convince a congregation to build a square church with no pitched roof, no steeple. So when I look at this guy's work, I see maybe an early sort of rebel in architecture like the Fountainhead, where he's saying, we're still doing classical architecture, it can still be classical, but we don't need to reinstate all the classical orders. This is probably one of the earliest modern, but of course it wasn't built, but these are probably very early Frank Lloyd Wright, ambitious rebellion projects. And of course, some of these probably were not built because, look at the way that they look. They're very unconventional and probably not widely accepted by the public. But of course, it is classical architecture, even without seeing the classical orders. You could argue that Venturi was saying that Mies van der Rohe was a classical architect because he's still building with the post and lintel type of construction, just in steel. So, it's kind of interesting, what is a truly classical building? It's hard to answer that. We've seen several months of classical architecture. This is a classical building. It has an arch. Who could argue this is not a classical building? We see the Greek temple front, the Roman drum. It's interesting when the architects go back to purity in architecture, they always go back to the Doric order. Rarely do they go back to Corinthian, because of course the Doric order in Tuscan is the simplest order. So I think this period is a really precursor to what you're saying, an early modern type of architecture. Modern being very relatively undecorated or unadorned. And somebody in the lecture last time was saying, it's interesting that we looked at some of the architects in the last lectures, that there's no entablature between the columns and of course the wall above that. Then of course you could argue that could be considered ugly because if you leave out important classical motifs, it's kind of a bastardization of an earlier form. But of course it's still beautiful because the opening in the arch still aligns with the neck of the column. You can see the proper ratio, the height, the proportion of the column. So it still has its own unique beauty to it. If I were to be a true classical architecture, I would always go back to these. I think these are really fascinating early modern studies in a classical realm, especially, who has projects like this right now. Maybe James Stewart Polchek when he did the planetarium building in Central Park. But
yeah, I mean, if you built that today, it would still be really surprising.
Oh, not only that, but the scale, I mean, that's enormous.
Yeah, that's a huge scale.
Oh, unbelievable. And it's also modern because it's, you know, Le Corbusier, and well, this is before Le Corbusier, but, you know, Corbusier takes the ground plane and displaces it on a roof terrace. That's very modern to do that, especially for the landscape. To take the ground plane and displace it above. That's probably 700 feet above the air. And it's interesting. Instead of doing a columnar or classical frieze, the trees are the frieze. That's really fascinating. They're original too.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, for somebody to build this today, oh my gosh, that would be insane amount of money. You have to use all the not experienced craftsmen, but specialty craftsmen to make all these parts. And in doing the research, I haven't really figured out where these actually would have gone. These are actually proposals for parts of Paris, but it would be nice to see where these actually could have fit. I think these are all just imaginary landscapes. But look what, you know, he did with the classical language. You know, these classical orders are probably larger than, because if you look at some of the early temples, Temple of Hera, the Temple of Jupiter, Luxor, those are larger than the Acropolis or the ancient Pantheon. These are probably, he's maximizing the scale of classical architecture in an unprecedented, you know, scale in these, you know, images. But the wonderful thing about when, you know, people derivate from the original form is that they still have a very strict classical language. It's good to have rules in architecture. Because some of my students in modern architecture, they just forget the rules and just do whatever they want to look, you know, crazy and sexy. But, you know, it kind of falls apart when they start developing it as a building. So. Okay, well, it's just about 1 o'clock. Any more closing questions? Or I hope you guys are learning something. You know, a lot of my lectures don't have a lot of terminology in them because we've seen a lot of the terms earlier in some of the first part of the classes, but it's good to observe in photographs and drawings different relationships. So.
This was very interesting. Thank you.
Good. So next Tuesday, we'll have another lecture in geometry and proportion, and then our next chapter will be predominantly classic literature, writings, and theory, and less buildings. So. Okay, well, stay tuned for next Tuesday. I will see you next week, and I hope you guys enjoyed the lecture. And thanks, Valerie, for inviting me to do the classes again.
Thank you, Jay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.